Welcome to our second micro lecture of the module. Today we will turn our attention to more of the designer stimulants, and we will finish the lecture by focusing on cocaine, the differences between powder and crack, and the sentencing discrepancies that we see with these two substances. Let's get started. To begin, we will turn our attention to MDMA or ecstasy. This is one of those designer amphetamines that continues to be popular with young people. It is currently a Schedule I drug and comes in a variety of pills with different colors, little faces, shapes, and symbols on them. There are a variety of different versions available, but this one is a little bit different compared to other stimulants that we have discussed. Ecstasy is part stimulant and part hallucinogen. This is what we call an actogen because it enhances sensory input and is a combination of psychedelic and stimulant effects when it releases both serotonin and dopamine. Ecstasy is often called the love drug. Most ecstasy users are very affectionate and happy and also want to have a lot of ecstasy. E broadens your senses and often leaves you feeling very aroused. This slide shows a picture of a variety of different ecstasy tablets. MDMA actually comes in a powdered form. It is then manufactured and packed into pills. The different colors and logos signify what? The colors and symbols on the ecstasy tablets represent the dealer who sells it. Think about them almost like little illicit calling cards. If you're taking the bright blue pill with a smiley face, then it came from this person. If you're taking a pink pill with the letter G on it, then it might come from this other person. Ecstasy pills are sometimes mixed with other active substances, most commonly amphetamines or speed, caffeine, and ephedrine, a natural amphetamine-like substance. They also can contain ketamine, which was developed as a horse tranquilizer and is most commonly used as a date rape drug. Ecstasy is like combining an amphetamine with LSD. So you're going to have that stimulated feeling, but then also experience the hallucinations that come from a psychedelic drug. Ecstasy really became popular as a club drug. Young people take them and they go to a rave. The house-style music, flashing lights, all of this has sensory overload that can contribute to your experience. But ecstasy doesn't come with the same crash that other types of amphetamines have. Instead, the user experiences other types of side effects. Take a look at this picture. What do these girls have in their mouths? Pacifiers, like those that a baby would use. Why do they have pacifiers in their mouth? Ecstasy actually makes you grind your teeth incessantly. The pacifiers help you to stop doing that in an effort to save your teeth. What else happens to your body when you take ecstasy? What are some of the symptoms? We already discussed the idea of teeth grinding, but you also see a strong loss of appetite, muscle aches and stiffness, sweating, rapid heartbeat, feelings of anger or hostility, feelings of anxiety, and eventual altered sleep patterns if the drug is used enough. One of the persistent problems with MDMA use is that of hyperthermia, heat stroke, or overheating. Not to be confused with hypothermia, which is related to extremely cold weather. Several factors add to the effect of hyperthermia, including MDMA's pharmacological effect of increasing body temperature, the strong physical stimulation experienced by most users, and the euphoria and comfort of the experience, which can cause users to overlook their level of exertion. Many ecstasy users have been told that they need to make sure they are drinking enough water to stay on the safe side of this problem. But as a result, some users encounter the somewhat less recognized problem of overhydration, which is commonly known as water intoxication. Normally, dependence can occur if the ecstasy user is using a lot. But if it's just recreational, meaning I'm partying on the weekends or something, then dependence is not as likely to occur. Either way, ecstasy is thought of as the smooth amphetamine because it does not normally have that strong crash that occurs after use. But if the user is dependent, then the biggest symptoms include depression and sleep disruption. In comparison to other drugs, this is not as bad a withdrawal process at all. All right, on to cocaine. Cocaine use is not a new occurrence, and we've talked about it a few times this semester already. We first saw a lot of cocaine being used in patent medicines, and then it became one of the first drugs to be made illegal and regulated by the Harrison Act of 1914. But we saw cocaine being used despite its illegality. It was not until the late 1970s and early 1980s that we saw cocaine have a resurgence. This became the drug of the 80s, and it was well known as the disco drug. It comes in two main forms, powder and crack cocaine. At the peak of cocaine use in this country, a user could purchase a small amount of crack cocaine for roughly $10. This is otherwise known as a dime bag. It was a very glamorous drug, and celebrities were well known for using cocaine. But if you were someone with money, then you wanted the powder. If you didn't have money, then you went after the crack. Crack was considered the poor man's version of the drug and was popular in many low-income, largely minority neighborhoods, despite the fact that these two drugs are nearly identical in nature. Pharmacologically, they are near identical in terms of their chemical composition. It is in the method of use and the materials that are made or that are used to cut the cocaine with that cause problems and have an impact on how potent the drug is. This occurs in much the same way that heroin is cut to extend the supply to as many buyers as possible. However, powder has less adulterants in it than crack does, but you can still remove them and have a stronger version of cocaine. When you cut the drug down, you make it cheaper and more affordable to a different market of people. Powder cocaine is typically snorted, whereas crack needs to be heated and smoked to be used. In terms of the composition of the drug and its methods of administration, crack is created when you take powder cocaine, add water and baking soda. It crystallizes and then forms the little rocks. That is ready for smoking. You need less of the drug than if you were using powder. Now all you need to do is put it in a pipe, add a heat source, and off you go. So powder you snort, and crack you either smoke or inject. Freebasing became very popular in the 1980s and kept on being popular despite fears regarding HIV, like we discussed in regards to heroin. People did not want to inject, and they figured out that freebasing can produce a better, quicker high sometimes than intravenous drug use. Freebasing occurs when you take powder, add a little liquid to it, either sodium carbonate or ammonium hydroxide. The cocaine will then dissolve along with its impurities. You can either add petroleum or ethyl ether to extract the cocaine. The cocaine floats to the top of the solution, and then all you need to do is take an eyedropper and draw out that solution. You then let the substance dry, and it will crystallize. Once it is crystallized, you simply crush it into a powder, and then you smoke it. Although powder and crack are pharmacologically similar, crack is often considered worse because of the quicker high. When you smoke a drug, it enters your lungs and the high is nearly instantaneous. Therefore, people enjoy it a lot more because the release of dopamine happens faster and it is often stronger than powder cocaine that you have to snort. Crack cocaine was always associated with low-income minority individuals until this man came along. This is a picture of Len Bias. Len Bias was a University of Maryland student, but not just any student. He was a star basketball player who had been drafted in the first round by the Boston Celtics. Less than 48 hours after he was drafted, he died from a cocaine overdose, but not powder. He overdosed on crack cocaine, and it caused a firestorm in Washington. Len Bias's death was a figurehead for politicians desperate to craft anti-cocaine legislation in this country. Immediately after Bias's overdose, a largely Republican Congress moved to push through more extensive legislation that built on the 1984 crime control measures that implemented mandatory minimums regarding illicit drug use throughout the United States. Len Bias was a terrific basketball player, but is known mostly for his overdose and for becoming the figurehead that surrounded the drugs' focused efforts on cocaine use. The legislative result of Bias's death was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which further extended mandatory minimums, asset forfeiture, and loads of other drug war goodies. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was part of the war on drugs passed by the United States Congress. Among other things, they changed the system of federal supervised release from a rehabilitative system into a punitive one. The 1986 Act also prohibited controlled substance analogs. The bill enacted new mandatory minimum sentences for drugs, including marijuana. This act in particular had one of the most wide impacts on incarceration and on the war on drugs. On average, the act increased the average incarceration time for drug-related charges from 22 months to 33 months. However, it was incarcerating more users than distributors or traffickers, which was one of the original goals of this legislation. The passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was created by a ton of media interest, as Len Bias was used as an example of what happens when those harder drugs make their way into our homes. Due in part to the media coverage, a moral panic was created, specifically focusing on cocaine use, which was now viewed as the most dangerous drug in the country at the time. President Reagan signed the law as it was supported by both a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. It is rare that you see such strong bipartisan support from both parties, but we saw each chamber trying to outdo the other in terms of severity. In terms of cocaine use, this act mandated a minimum sentence of 5 years without parole for possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, while it mandated the same sentence for possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. This 100-to-1 ratio disparity essentially created one of the most significant sentencing disparities based on race that this country has ever seen. Due to the passage of this act, we saw federal prison rates skyrocket for minority offenders, whereas there was essentially no increase in the incarceration rates of white offenders. The rate of incarceration for Black defendants rose from 50 out of 100,000 people to 250 out of 100,000 adults nearly overnight. In the years that followed the passage of this act, incarceration sentences for Black offenders were 49% longer than those of white offenders for the same exact crime. In 2002, the U.S. Sentencing Commission, meaning the agency that establishes federal sentencing structures and maintains the federal sentencing guidelines, acknowledged that the 100-to-1 ratio was created based on the, quote, misperception of the dangers of crack cocaine, which has been proven to have a less drastic effect than previously thought, unquote. In 2009, the Sentencing Commission also commented on the racial implications of these policies and how many minority offenders were incarcerated compared to white individuals. This was not the first time that the Sentencing Commission recommended a change. They first made recommendations back in 1994 under the Clinton administration, which declined to act. Eventually, in 2010, during the first Obama administration, the Fair Sentencing Act reduced the sentencing ratio to 18-to-1, when crack was increased to 28 grams, meaning 1 ounce. It also eliminated the 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for simple possession of crack. This was the compromise plan, as the original version of the legislation actually eliminated the sentencing disparity completely, despite having some level of bipartisan support. However, as you know, politicians don't always play nice together, and for many, the total elimination of the ratio was just too much. When originally signed, it was estimated that from 2011 to 2015, the prison population would decrease by over 1,500 individuals and would save the country more than 42 million during that time period. The Fair Sentencing Act was a step in the right direction, but it did not take other drugs into account when easing these burdens. Critics state that marijuana should have been included in this restructuring to reflect the differences between state and federal legislation outlawing the use of marijuana in certain jurisdictions. In this micro lecture, we focused on two different stimulant drugs, ecstasy and cocaine. While these are not the only types of stimulants out there, these are the ones with the highest rates of use in this country. We also glanced at them rather quickly. We will focus on cocaine use more later this semester when we examine the war on drugs. In the next module, we will turn our attention to hallucinogens, and we will explore the effects that these drugs have on our minds and our actions. It's always a fun discussion. Thank you for your attention today, and I will see you back here next time.